excited to take you on a plant walk. Of course, I'd rather have you here in person, but that's a little difficult right now, and you'll have all been asking me to make plant walk videos. So here I am in the woods. So let's talk about some of these trees first. I love to talk about tree medicine and edible trees because I don't feel like that many people actually talk about them. And there's so much food and medicine in the trees. So let's start with this tree right here. And this is a regional tree of Appalachia, which is where we are in western North Carolina today. And so you may or may not have it in your region, depending on where you're at. This is called sourwood, and it's in the heath family, which is the Ericaceae, or what I like to call the blueberry family, because we don't have lots of heaths here, unless you go way up high on the mountains. So, sourwood, these leaves are edible, and the way that I identify them is they have teeny little teeth on the edges, and they also have little tiny hairs, which maybe we can find a better example, but they have little tiny hairs along what's called the midrib of the plant. So if you look at this, you might be able to see those teeny tiny hairs on the back of that main vein and those little tiny teeth. And so that's a great way to identify this plant because it can look a lot like wild cherry, which we would not want to put in our mouth. So this is a really good opportunity to talk about 100% positive identification. Always, always have 100% positive identification before you put anything in your mouth. So, yeah, sourwood is delicious. I love to eat the leaves, and it can really help quench your thirst. It doesn't actually hydrate you, but if you were out in the woods and you were thirsty, you could chew on this and it would help satisfy you for a little while. So we never want to pick more than 10% of the leaves on a tree, especially before the fall, because that's how it makes its food, through photosynthesis. And so the sunlight goes in and the leaves make the sugars that feed the plant. So just remember that. It's probably like if you're just eating these, you're probably not going to eat more than 10% of them, but sometimes we get super excited and we're like, woo, I found something edible. I want to pick all of them. So don't do that, please. Ethics and sustainability, super important. So sourwood I also love because there is delicious honey that the bees make from these flowers. So that's another awesome thing about sourwood. And maybe we'll see some bigger sourwood trees and we could look at the bark, because the bark is very distinctive and it looks kind of like crocodile skin. So it's very scaly. And also when you see a sourwood, you're likely to see rhododendrons, which we're surrounded by right now, because they both really love acidic soil. And that is the habitat that we're in here in western North Carolina. So that is sourwood. Now, let's talk about another tree. So there's one right next to it that is also pretty regional in Appalachia, but it has a little bit of a wider region. And this is one of my most favorite trees. This is sassafras. And I love it for so many reasons. I am the co-founder and co-teacher at the Sassafras School of Appalachian Plantcraft, so I must love sassafras a lot. I also have a handmade knife with a sassafras handle made by Sassafras Forge, so really, really love sassafras, obviously, because it's beautiful, and it's edible, and it's medicinal. These leaves are really tasty and delicious, and One really great way to identify them is by the shape of their leaves. And so they're very unique. You can tell that there are actually 3 different shapes of leaves here. So we have a regular kind of oval shaped leaf, and they can be bigger than this too. This is a little one. We have a mitten, and then we have what I like to call a turkey foot. So I've heard people call it a Tyrannosaurus foot, heard people call it a ghost or a trident. Whatever helps you to remember, making up stories is really going to help you. So those mnemonic devices are awesome. We have our 3 different shapes of leaves. I only know one other plant that does this, and that is mulberry, and it looks a little bit different. One other thing I like to look at is the shape or the structure of the tree. And you don't often see a lot of big sassafras anymore. There are some blights. It's really unfortunate. But if we look at the shape of the tree, it really likes to stretch its limbs out wide. And it does this kind of swoopy thing. That's not the technical term. But it will spread its branches out wide, and then another branch will come from the end of that branch, and it will spread out that way. And also, if we look closely, we'll see that the new growth, these young branches, are green. So that's another great way to recognize this plant. So as I said, this is what we call a demulcent in herbalism. So think about what happens when you cook okra, and you'll know what a demulcent is. So basically when you chew it, it's going to get slimy, and that might sound gross, but it's actually really good for us. And my favorite word in herbalism is mucilaginous. And it's kind of like it sounds, so that's slime, right? And that slime is really great for coating and soothing our mucous membranes. So especially in our respiratory system and our digestive system. And now would be a really great time to harvest no more than 10% of these leaves and dry them for winter when it gets dry and we have respiratory issues like dry coughs and things, or we just have forced air, or maybe you have a wood stove and it can be irritating to your respiratory system. It's great to have good demulcent herbs around. And demulcents actually extract better in cold water. So you could also do room temperature water. I mean, if it's the middle of winter, you probably don't want to be drinking cold water. I know I don't. And it's not actually really good for us. So you can just cut up the leaves coarsely, cover them with water, and then leave them there for an hour or more, or as long as you can. And then drink that water, and it'll be so soothing. It's also cooling, which is really nice midsummer. However, I will say that I've noticed that the longer you leave the tea out, it will actually ferment pretty quickly. So if you're going to leave it out overnight to infuse, put it in the refrigerator. That's my little tip for you. Besides just eating the leaves are also known as filé powder or gumbo filé, and so they're a great thickener. That sliminess helps to thicken things like gumbo, but not just gumbo, other soups and stews, and I love to add it to my curry. So think about that. All I do is I'll dry these leaves, I'll throw them in a coffee grinder, grind them up, and just keep that powder in a little jar in my kitchen, and whenever I need a thickener, just throw some in there. Super easy, right? Now, something that's not as easy is digging the roots of sassafras. The roots of sassafras are a traditional tea. It goes way, way, way back, and it's delicious. It's also a little bit demulcent, but not as demulcent as the leaves. It's what's called an alterative in herbalism. An alterative helps clear metabolic waste from our system. So it was really popular as a tea in the early spring. to clear all the junk from being more sedentary over the winter. And it also helps bring our body back into balance. So you can think about that. It's really hard to dig though. What happens is that root goes into the ground and it kind of takes a 90-degree turn and then it corkscrews. So imagine trying to dig that. So we could find a place where there's lots of seedlings, because they do like to shoot off little seedlings, and we could dig those so they'll be smaller and easier to dig. But it still is an effort, but it's going to be worth it, I promise you. And then something really important to remember is you always want to cut those roots into like coin-sized pieces before you dry them, because if you wait until after, you will have to use a handsaw, and I've done it and it's hard. So cut them beforehand. And of course we don't want to harvest roots unless there's an abundance of the tree around. So look for that, but again, they shoot off runners, so if there's a bunch of runners, you're pretty good. And I just love sassafras so much. It's a wonderful native tree. So our next tree that we're going to talk about, there's so many. Western North Carolina is one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. It's pretty amazing. So if you're like, hey, I don't see these plants where I live, that's totally fine. Some of them you can grow, or you might just have to go to another region, but do what you can with what you have. I want to talk about this tree right here. Another one of my favorites. I have a lot. This is witch hazel, and you might know about this from the pharmacy or the grocery store, seeing that little bottle that they call witch hazel, but witch hazel is actually a shrub or a tree or small tree, and this is what they make that from. And you can make your own very cheaply and easily. And so how do we recognize this shrub? Well, there are several ways. It's a lot easier if it's flowering. And witch hazel flowers at an odd time of the year. There are 2 native species in the United States, and this one flowers in the late fall. So often like October and November when nothing else is flowering. So it's easy to recognize then. The other species flowers in the late winter to really early spring. So oftentimes around March, like late February, early March. And so it's really easy to recognize then. It has very unique yellow flowers, and they have what they call strappy petals. So the petals are long and narrow. Some other ways we can recognize this plant are by these leaves. And so if we look at one of these leaves, like this one, there's something that happens. I'm going to pull another one too that maybe is a better example. There we go. So if we look at the base of this leaf, you notice that the leaf base is really asymmetrical. You'll also notice it's got these scalloped edges, so kind of rounded lobes on it, and the leaf itself is almost round. Notice those things, and that will help you identify this shrub. It also, as it gets bigger, tends to reach out more, just like the sassafras. And we can also notice that these veins are almost parallel to each other in the way that they come out. There's a couple other ways to recognize this plant, depending on what time of year it is. They get a very unique shaped fruit on them, not a fruit like we would eat. It's a hard fruit. It's about that big, and it's got 4 little rounded points on the end of it, and then the other side is round. So you can look for that. Also, it tends to get galls on the leaves. And here's one right here, and it's very pointy. You could think of a witch's hat, and that might help you remember. So this is a specific kind of insect that causes this. And galls are caused by wasps and flies. It's a really cool phenomenon, actually. Some people might think it's gross. That's fine. But I'm a nature lover, and I think it's really neat. And so what happens is that the insect has a special part of its body called an ovipositor, and it sticks that ovipositor into the leaf and inserts its eggs into the leaf along with some of its own chemicals from its body, and those stimulate the leaf to grow the gall out of its own tissue. So that's actually leaf tissue from this plant. So it's kind of like a cancer in the human body. What the leaf is trying to do is protect itself. So kind of isolate this as if it were a disease. And then what it does is it protects the eggs, and it provides food for the larva when it hatches. So it just eats its way out of that little gall. But supposedly it doesn't damage the plant at all. It's pretty neat. I like it. Medicine of witch hazel. How is it made? Let's talk about it. I have a recipe for this in my book, The Herbal Handbook for Homesteaders, which you can find on my website, thewanderschool.com. And it's a lot easier to explain there. But the super simple folk method is to usually harvest the bark. But I prefer not to harvest bark if I don't have to. And these branches usually grow pretty low and within reach. So I would much prefer to harvest these twigs. So what I'll do is take my handy pruner, and I would harvest a twig that is the size of my pinky in circumference or smaller. And I would cut it right here, so where it's joining a bigger branch. And if you do that, there's actually special cells in there that stimulate regrowth of the plant. So you're much less likely to introduce diseases or pests than you would be if you were harvesting bark. So we would just cut it just like that, and we would take this and cut these twigs into about inch-long pieces or so and strip off the leaves. We could add the leaves and the twigs into a jar, just cover them with a low percentage of alcohol, around 40% or so, and then we just let it sit for a couple weeks. I actually prefer to do this with apple cider vinegar because it's not going to dry out the skin as much. If I'm using alcohol, I'll dilute it by about half when it's done, so that, again, it's not as drying, but I prefer vinegar. So that's the basics of how you make your own witch hazel. It's going to have more plant material than it would if you bought it from the store, and it's going to be probably more pure and better for you, and it's definitely going to be cheaper. So I encourage you to do that yourself if you have witch hazel growing near you in abundance. It loves to grow in this habitat that we're in, so kind of a moist, rich woodland. But again, you can grow it yourself. We found another herb. This one's in the mint family. It's right here. Could also be edible. You could eat these leaves. They're very mild flavored. It's one of the rare mint family mints that doesn't taste like mint. This is called self-heal, or heal all, because it was thought to be a panacea to heal everything. And its Latin name is Prunella vulgaris. That vulgaris part doesn't mean vulgar like ew, disgusting. It means vulgar like common, like the common people. And that often means that this species was the one that was worked with in medicine, so the common one for medicine. And we can tell it's in the mint family because it has a square stem and opposite leaves, and these funny little flowers have a little lip on the bottom petal, or little lips. And this plant is very characteristic. It's easy to recognize because of these unique flowers. So it has this column of these little tiny pink flowers. It doesn't usually get much higher than this. So if it were a foot high, that would be for sure the tallest you would ever see it. And this one is great for so many things. It's an antiviral. So if you were starting to come down with a flu or something, it would be a great one to take as tea or as tincture. I will tincture the whole above ground plant, flowers, leaves, stem, all of it. It's also great in salves. It's super healing as just a all-purpose kind of salve. You could do that. And yeah, for coughs, colds, flus, all kinds of things, this is a wonderful one to make into tea or tincture. And it's pretty prolific, so we usually don't have to worry about over harvesting it. It's very sustainable to harvest it. And I would just cut it like, you know how if you cut basil in your garden, you'll just cut the tops. You could cut it that way, or you could cut it down closer to the bottom and leave a pair of or two of leaves at the bottom, and then it will regrow. So that is self-heal or heal all. This is another delicious tree. It's called black birch or sweet birch, and its botanical name is Betula lenta, which is a little confusing if you know Latin, because you would think that it's Betula nigra, which nigra means black, but Betula nigra is actually river birch. So this is called Betula lenta because it has what are called lenticels on it. So it has little tiny dots on the bark, and then when it gets bigger, those dots will become horizontal lines on that bark, and that is one way to recognize it. However, this is another one that can look really similar to wild cherry. And wild cherry has lenticels on the bark as well, and toothed leaves just like this. So we want to look at some other characteristics as well to help us identify it. One of the main ones for this specific species is that it will have pairs of leaves that come off together. Not every leaf comes off in a pair, but some of them do. And as we look at this tree, you'll see several pairs coming off together on this tree. So that is a great way to recognize this tree. Another way is scratch and sniff. So I really believe that this is where scratch and sniff came from, is from identifying trees. If we scratch this bark just a little bit, be kind to the tree, and then we smell it. Get your nose in there. Botany is a contact sport, as my friends like to say. It smells wonderful. It smells like wintergreen, and that's a lot of what it tastes like too. Super delicious. If it smells like wintergreen, you know that you have the right plant. Again, we'll harvest these twigs instead of harvesting the bark because it's less invasive to the tree. So again, we're going to find the smaller twigs. I like to find the ones that are coming off the sides of branches. So I would harvest this one right here. I would strip off these leaves, and I have heard that they're good for preventing kidney stones if you've had kidney stones before, but I haven't read anything about that. That was just hearsay. So research it yourself. Do your own research. It's good practice. But I would harvest these twigs and strip the leaves. You could just hang them to dry. You could bundle them in a small bundle and hang them to dry. Or you could cut them up into small pieces and make what's called a decoction. And that's simply a tea where you simmer the harder parts of the herbs because they're harder to extract. So we could just simmer these for 5 to 20 minutes or so. The longer we simmer them, the more medicine you're going to get out of them, but 20 minutes is totally long enough. And then you're going to get a delicious tea that tastes like wintergreen. and also, interestingly enough, like root beer, because if you've heard of birch beer, it's a non-alcoholic, kind of like a ginger ale that is made from birch. So, gonna be delicious. You could ferment it and make a soda or a birch beer, and you could make a tea. You could tincture these twigs as well and keep it around for pain, because it has what are called methyl salicylates in it, and those are phytochemicals. You might have heard salicylic acid, and that is what is in aspirin and what is in acne medications. And basically, it's an anti-inflammatory and an analgesic. So good for relieving inflammation and for relieving pain. Also, not supposed to have the same side effects that aspirin does. Really good to know. However, if you're allergic to aspirin, just in case, it's better to stay away from any salicylates. But it shouldn't mess up the stomach lining like aspirin does. Really wonderful to have around, and again, it's tasty, so if you can make your medicine taste good, that's always a bonus. So it's called methyl salicylates because of that minty taste. And there are other birches that have salicylates that aren't methyl salicylates. They don't taste minty. Willow has salicylates in it as well, which is what aspirin was synthesized from. There are other plant options as well for salicylates, but this is a really good plant to know. Great first aid plant. And hopefully, if you're lucky, it's growing around you. Let's talk for just a minute, now that we've talked about several trees, about a little teeny tiny mushroom that's growing right here on the ground. Here it is. So you can see how tiny it is. It's right next to my finger there. And I'm going to pick it so that you can see it in the underside to help you identify it. So there it is. It's got a little bit of soil on it. That's okay. This is called a cinnabar chanterelle. Yes, it's a real chanterelle, and it's tiny. And it has this orangish reddish color to it. It has these gill-like structures which look a lot like gills but are not true gills. You want to look for that, and of course you always want to have 100% positive identification. It is possible that there could be lookalikes. Don't eat these if you're not sure. I just wanted to show them to you. And you can totally eat these, of course, only once they're cooked. And it will take quite a few of them, however, to make a decent amount to eat. So, just so you know. But they are delicious, just like other chanterelles. I found this very interesting plant growing, and I wanted to tell you about it because it's relatively rare and it grows extremely slowly, so it gives us a really good opportunity to talk about ethics and sustainability of foraging and wildcrafting. It's right here, and I called it a plant, but I'd actually be more accurate to call it an organism because it's a symbiotic organism. So fluffy. So this is a kind of reindeer moss, but even though it's called a moss, it's actually a lichen. Some people say it's an algae and a fungus. That's what people used to say. But now people are saying it's an algae and 2 species of fungi, or I've even heard an algae, a fungus, and a bacteria. So again, you can do your own research, but I know that it's so nice and soft and it makes you just want to pick it, but you can just lay down on it and feel how nice it is and leave it there. Unfortunately, some people confuse this for another medicinal lichen that's called usnea, or old man's beard. And I'm sure that this lichen has some medicinal properties as well, but I don't know what they are, and I wanted to point it out because some lichens grow extremely slowly, including this one. This one, I read, can grow as slowly as 1 millimeter a year. So think about that. A millimeter is teeny, teeny, tiny. So please, please don't harvest it. Just look at it, enjoy it, feel the fuzzy softness, and move on down the road. So that's your little sustainability lesson for today. And we're going to talk about another plant that is growing in abundance. So we can harvest a pretty good amount of that. And we can see there's several of them over here. I'm looking at this plant right here. You might be able to see it has thorns on it, and it has little berries on it. This is a blackberry. The way that I can tell that it's a blackberry specifically is if we look at these stems, we can see they have little ridges on them. And only blackberries have those ridges. Good identification characteristic for us. They also have compound leaves. This plant, this specific plant right here, has compound leaves mostly with 3 leaflets. So this whole thing is 1 leaf with 3 leaflets. And then we can see back here, there's some blackberries that have been eaten by something, but this one has 5 leaflets in that compound leaf. They can really vary, just so you know. Plants have a lot of variation. That's what nature is. It's variation. Again, compound leaves, ridged stem. Of course, if we see the berries, we will know. These have a lot of medicine in them. I very recently found out, so interestingly, that, we think that red raspberry is so great for toning the uterus, and it is, but people often think that it's the only one that's good for that. And I recently learned that blackberry is actually better than red raspberry, and it grows in abundance. So what could be better than that? Of course, if you're growing raspberries, you can harvest the leaves, but if we find blackberries in the wild, which we're likely to do in much of the United States, we can harvest the leaves. Of course, carefully, you'd probably want to use gloves because they have thorns all over them. So what I'll do is, again, if it's this time of year, I'll only harvest about 10% of the leaves from the plant, and I just harvest them by pulling this whole leaf backwards, and it'll come off like that. Pretty easy. And then I'll put those in a bag, take them home, dry them, and keep them for tea. You could also tincture these. The roots of blackberry are incredible as an astringent, especially for diarrhea. However, if you don't want to go to the trouble of digging up the root, you could just harvest these leaves and tincture those. You could also make a tea for diarrhea, but like most things, the tincture is going to be a little bit stronger. So, this is in the rose family, blackberry, along with raspberries and, of course, roses and a lot of the fruits that we eat. Kind of interesting that way. And a lot of leaves in the rose family can be worked with as an astringent. It's really good to know, and it's great to start learning flowers because you'll learn these little tips and secrets. So again, I'll just harvest these leaves and dry them for tea later. I also recently learned from my teacher, Leslie Williams, that you can put these on a countertop or a cutting board and roll over them with a rolling pin or hit them a little bit with a hammer, and it will actually help them to ferment a little bit as they dry, just like black tea. And then you can have that black tea taste without the caffeine. Kind of cool. Oh, I didn't mean for this to be a mushroom walk, but we can totally throw in some mushrooms. That's so exciting. I wonder if there's more of those. There probably are. We were over here munching on some sassafras leaves, and as often happens when you slow down, you find other interesting things. So we found a delicious mushroom. These mushrooms are just starting to come out this year. It's almost August. It's also a mushroom that I love. It's right here. This one's kind of small, but I'm going to pick it anyway so I can show you. And I'm just going to pull it right out like that. I could cut it with a knife so I wouldn't get that dirt on the bottom, but that's alright. Can cut that off later. This is called a leatherback milk cap. If you can see the top, it kind of looks like leather. And if we look at the bottom, this magical thing will happen. So here we go. Check it out. There's milk in there. What? It's true. There's a milky substance that comes out when you break it. That's how we know it's a milk cap. So you can do this trick, please, only if you're sure that it's a leatherback. But you can take your finger and you can touch that milk, and then you can touch it to your tongue. If it's not bitter, then you know it's the right leatherback, because there are other ones that are super duper bitter, and we probably wouldn't want to eat them because they're going to be bitter when we cook them, which we want to cook all our mushrooms. I know that's weird. Y'all are used to eating the little button mushrooms, but really, most of us can't digest them unless they're cooked. Some mushrooms are poisonous. If they're not cooked, some are poisonous all the time. So be aware. But these are delicious. I'm going to take this home, cook it up really well. They're really awesome on pizza, but also just cooked by themselves or in a stir fry. Super delish. Yum. Feel so lucky to have just found this mushroom. This tree is called hemlock. I love talking about it because inevitably people will ask me, is that poison hemlock? No, it's not, which is the trouble with English, or what we call common names, because sometimes more than one plant has the same common name like this one. And this tree, it is a tree, so poison hemlock is not a tree. It's an herbaceous plant that's in the carrot family and can grow about this tall, which hemlock is usually bigger than this. This is a seedling. So they're very different, and this is an evergreen tree in the pine family. Obviously not an herbaceous plant. And right now, it's kind of late for this year, so I'm surprised to see this, but I'm glad we caught it. It has these bright green tips. Evergreen tips like this are delicious. You could eat them like this, although I probably wouldn't eat many of them because it could kind of hurt your stomach. But awesome things to do with them are to infuse them into salt. And I'll just throw them into a coffee grinder with some salt and mix it up that way and sprinkle it on food. Some people like to infuse it into sugar and put it on things like sugar cookies. I will also infuse it into vinegar, like apple cider vinegar, and it makes a lovely marinade or topping for greens, or a vinaigrette if you mix it with oil. Super duper wonderful. And we always, again, I'm going to say it a million times so you make sure to hear it, 100% positive identification, because this could look like another tree that's called yew, Y-E-W, or taxus is its botanical name. And we wouldn't want to eat that one because that one is poisonous. And that one gets red berries, but it won't have red berries all year. And most of the time, if we're out in the wild, what we're going to be finding is hemlock. And hemlock has smaller needles that are more pointed at the end than the U, but again, just please, please, please make sure before you put anything in your mouth. So, it's delicious little tips. Now we're going to talk about a teeny tiny plant. The teeny tiny flower. The plant itself is not that small, but the flower really is. So here it is. We can see that it's uniquely shaped. It's got these 3 little petals on the bottom. And we can also notice these leaves aren't super distinct, but they have little white tips on the edge of the teeth. And as this flower gets older, it will develop an ovary back here, a seed pod that will turn into a seed pod, and that seed pod will become swollen. And that's what we want, because this species is Lobelia inflata, and that means inflated. So an inflated seed pod, it looks kind of like a little green balloon at the back of the flower. And that's how we know we have the medicinal species, or what's considered the medicinal species of Lobelia. This is incredibly medicinal and an incredibly strong medicine. So we want to have a lot of respect for it. Lobelia is a wonderful medicine for the respiratory system. It's a bronchodilator, so great for folks with asthma. Some people have more success with it than others though, so it's something you might want to try out in small doses first before you have a full-on asthma attack, and probably not replace your inhaler with it, so make sure to always have an inhaler around. And it can be really helpful though, so for things like asthma or other respiratory conditions involving the lungs. I've also had some relief from taking it in tincture for back pain. So think about that. This is one that we wouldn't really take in a tea because it's extremely bitter. So we can make a tincture out of it. Some people will smoke these leaves, and it will help if you're trying to quit smoking tobacco. It actually satisfies those nicotine receptors in the brain. It can be really helpful that way. This is Lobelia, and Lobelia is the common name and the botanical name. Again, Lobelia inflata. And it is a native wildflower, but since we only see one right here, I wouldn't harvest this one. I want to be super sustainable when I'm wildcrafting and only harvest it if I see a big patch of plants. So at least 20. If I saw 20, maybe I would take one. If I saw several patches of 20, I'd take a couple maybe out of every patch. And then I would harvest. I usually like to leave a couple leaves at least at the bottom of the plant, and then cut right above a leaf and take the rest, the top part of the plant. But again, only when it has those inflated seed pods, so that we know it's the medicinal species. Standing here in this wet shaded area with 2 plants that look a lot like each other and can be confused for each other. So I wanted to show you the difference, because one is toxic and one is edible and medicinal. Really good to know the difference. Let's take a look. This one right here with these bigger leaves is called ragwort. So if you hear the ending wort, that actually just means herb. So now you know, things like mugwort. And this supposedly was a medicine back in the day to help, I believe, with bleeding after giving birth. But we don't do a whole lot with it today. It's not fatally toxic, but it would make you sick if you ingested it, at least in large quantity. So we don't want to do that. I want to show you the plant that it's often mistaken for. And you can see little ones over here, and here's a bigger one. Some of you may know this already. This is violet. This is the leaf of violet. This is probably common blue violet, which has more of a purple than a blue flower, but whatever. And there's one main way that I tell them apart, and that is that the top of this leaf comes to a point on the violet. You can tell that it doesn't on the ragwort. Violets won't always have points on the top, but ragwort will never have a point. So the mnemonic device that I use is I turn this leaf upside down, and it's like a V for violet. So that's helpful to help you remember. There's some really beautiful violet leaves back here that we can see just have some kind of natural variegation going on, and they're beautiful colors that I have rarely seen before. So it's kind of neat. And violet is, like I said, it's edible and medicinal. So the flowers and the leaves are edible. Their roots are toxic, so don't eat the roots, sorry, but you can eat the leaves and you can eat the flowers of all violets except not African violet, because it's not a true violet. Just FYI. So I could eat this. It's another mucilaginous demulcent, good for soothing our mucous membranes, which is great because it's wonderful for coughs as well. I love to put it in my cough syrup, especially for a cough that was dry. This could help moisten that cough and your respiratory system and make you a little bit more comfortable when you have a cough. However, if you eat a lot of this, it will cause diarrhea, especially if you're not used to eating wild things. So be aware of that. Don't make a pesto out of it. But you could add it in a salad with other leafy greens and it would be delightful. In herbal medicine, people will also take violets and put them in tea or tincture for things like abscesses and boils. You could also make a compress out of the tea. That's good to know as well. But please eat these in moderation. I'm here looking at this herb, which a lot of you may know, or at least have heard of, most likely. This is St. John's wort. It's in the Hypericum genus, and this looks like Hypericum punctatum, which is actually a native St. John's wort. You also might find Hypericum perforatum, which is the European species that is more well known for medicine, but this one is medicinal as well. If you live in this area, like western North Carolina, where it's super biodiverse, you might find other species of St. John's wort, and some of them are rare, so please don't harvest them unless you know which species you have. So a good field guide will help you. And there's a couple of characteristics you can look for. So if I hold this leaf up to the light, I can see there are the tiniest black dots on it. And maybe we can get a good close-up and you can see those. But they're teeny tiny and they're little glands, and that's one way to identify the species that have hypericin in them, which is thought to be one of the phytochemicals that is great for fighting depression. Another thing we can look for is these little buds on here. And so if we take a bud and we squeeze it, what happens is it should leave a reddish liquid on my fingers, which it's not doing right now. But ideally it would. So let's see if we can do it again. Ah, there it is. So, see that reddish liquid that's on my fingers? That's what we want to see. And that's how we know that it has hypericin in it. Now, contrary to some popular opinion, there are lots and lots of phytochemicals in plants, and it's always more than one of them that makes a plant medicinal. And I recently found out that other species of St. John's wort are medicinal as well, but just in different ways. So go look up the research on that and find out for yourself. Now, I wouldn't harvest this one because it's the only one. But again, if I found a big patch of these, I would harvest them. And I would harvest probably about here. I'd want to get some of these leaves and then definitely the flower. And then what I do is I tincture it. You'll also know that you have a species with hypericin in it if your tincture turns red. And it turns the most beautiful red color. It's really lovely and magical to watch as well. You can also make an oil with St. John's wort that is great for nerves. So if you're having nerve pain, you can put that oil on topically and it can be really helpful. St. John's wort, great for depression, seasonal affective disorder, and also for nerve pain. However, you want to be careful. It is contraindicated with a lot of medication, so especially birth control and other antidepressants, and it can affect the effectiveness of other pharmaceutical medications. So please do your research on that one. We were walking along and I just found another mushroom. It's a mushroom day. Let's check it out. Here it is. Often you'll see these in groups, but I just found one. This is another kind of chanterelle, so we can tell it's bigger and less red than the other one. And we can also tell a little bit easier on this one that these are not true gills. So that's a little confusing, but if you've seen gills before, you can kind of see that these just look like they are attached and connected to that surface and not a separate structure. They kind of have those wrinkles in between, and this is going to be delicious later. So keep an eye out for chanterelles. They are a pretty noticeable color. However, there are some poisonous mushrooms that are this color, like jack-o'-lantern specifically. So please, please do your research, again, before you put anything in your mouth. And we always want to cook our mushrooms, right? Right. This is a wild mint called mountain mint. It's in the Pycnanthemum genus, which actually means compact flower. So we can see it has this compact head of flowers, which are white with little purple dots. And so this is a wild mint. There are multiple different species of mountain mint, and what I found is that they all taste a little bit different from each other. So I'd encourage you to find some and try them out, of course, using 100% positive identification. See which ones that you like the best. You can also grow mountain mint if you want, and it is medicinal for flus, colds, and fevers, and also as a compress for headaches. I like to pick the tops with the leaves and put them in my water bottle to help refresh me during a hot hike. It's really nice for that. But again, some of these I like the taste a little bit better than others. And the wild mints tend to be a little bit spicier than the cultivated mints that we're used to, like peppermint or spearmint. The taste of these tends to be a little bit closer to oregano. So try them out, see if you like them, and again, notice that they have the characteristics of other mints. A square stem and opposite leaves and flowers that the bees love with little lips on their bottom petals. Thanks so much for watching, and I just want to remind you of a few important things. So, as always, we want to have 100% positive identification before we put anything in our mouth. We want to cook all of our mushrooms, and we always want to research plants before we harvest them to make sure they're actually prolific, because we could live somewhere like this in western North Carolina where things look prolific, but they might only be prolific here. A good resource for that is United Plant Savers. You can check their website where they have a species at risk list and even become a member if you want to support the work that they're doing. But make sure you research your plants before you harvest them. And I didn't talk about it, but it's also a great idea to give gratitude to the plants whenever you harvest them, because they're giving so much of themselves and often their whole lives for our food and our medicine. So thank you so much for coming on this walk with me, and you can learn more at thewanderschool.com and get ongoing botanical education at patreon.com/thewanderschool. Happy foraging and wildcrafting!